Welcome to Zealots of the Gate, a podcast of Comment Magazine. I'm Matthew Kaemingk.
I'm Shadi Hamid.
Together we research politics, religion, and the future of democracy at Fuller Seminary's Mao Institute of Faith and Public Life.
We are writing a book together. This podcast represents an informal space where we can talk about how to live with deep difference. Thanks so much for joining us. Hi, everyone. Make sure to subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts. Please leave us a review. We love 5-star ones, but, if you don't love us, please feel free to be honest. Join the conversation, and there's a number of ways to do that with us. You can ask us questions on Twitter by using the hashtag ZealotsPod, and we do check that. Or feel free to email us at zealots@comment.org. For those of you who are new to the podcast, I'm Shadi Hamid. I'm a Muslim. My co-host and friend is Matthew Kaemingk. He is not. He's a Christian. He studies theology, and I'm a political scientist. And sometimes we disagree. And we'll find out how much we're going to do that today.
Yeah, man. And today we're going to be talking about being a person of faith in a secular society. And this has come in stark relief for you, Shadi, as we were just talking before we started recording about how Ramadan's going and fasting in Washington, D.C. with a lot of people who are eating and drinking. And I just realized in our last podcast on fasting, I was drinking a cup of tea right in front of you.
Oh my God. Wait. I didn't even notice that.
Yeah, that was not a terribly sensitive thing for me to do, and I'm actually doing it again today. So I apologize for that, brother.
No, but Matt, it's okay because you're not fasting, so you shouldn't have to feel like you have to change the way you live just because you're talking to me. I wouldn't want to put you in that position.
But it's an interesting point because there actually is an aspect of Christianity that talks about actually changing your eating habits to create a better space for those around you who have eating issues. So it's part of being a good neighbor in Christianity, actually, to be a little bit more sensitive to that. So the tea, I'm sliding further away from me, and out of solidarity today, brother, not out of spiritual tourism. No tea for me.
Yeah, I appreciate that.
First, Shadi, I'd love to hear just a little bit about how Ramadan's going because, the last week we chatted, we talked about all the wonderful benefits of fasting, but it seems not to be going as great for you right now. And maybe you could tell us just a little bit about that.
Yeah. So I was in a better mood about Ramadan and fasting in the previous episode, which you guys should check out. And, what's really cool about this podcast is that we change in real time. And, I want to be more open and personal in this episode. I guess I am to some extent in all of them, but this probably will up the ante a little bit because I'm a little bit annoyed and frustrated. And it's the last week in particular has been quite difficult for me in terms of fasting and figuring out how to align my fasting schedule and my desire to be more focused on religion and spirituality with a very busy time in my work life. And I really feel overwhelmed. And the fact that I can't be, fully engaged and productive because I am very dependent on coffee. So generally my normal thing is that I'll go to a Starbucks and just park there. Because the cool thing about Starbucks is that you can just order a drip coffee, then get unlimited free refills. And there's, it's just really convenient. But having that coffee there, it's almost like, it's not even just the effect of the caffeine. It makes me go on. It gives me strength just knowing that it's there. And maybe that's a weakness that I have. And part of the challenge of Ramadan is to see, can I separate myself from that need? Anyway, I think that sometimes there's a risk of feeling a kind of resentment towards religion when you feel that it's putting you in a place of hardship. And that's made me think more about this question of how difficult is religion supposed to be? And there is this tension in Islam on precisely this issue. And I was reading Quran the other night, and I just randomly came across a prophetic hadith that was in the commentary, and then an actual Quranic verse. But just to give folks an example, in a section about fasting in particular, this is the verse 185. It says, God desires ease for you, and he does not desire hardship for you. Now, the irony of that is that that's actually that verse is in the context of the Ramadan fast, that there is actually, so if you're sick, if you're ill, you don't have to fast. And so God is saying that he doesn't want to make it difficult if you're going through a kind of health situation, right? But even for the healthy, Ramadan is quite challenging in the context of Washington, D.C. or America as Muslim minorities, as we talked about in the previous episode, because we don't have that kind of broader encouragement from the rest of society. So I've been feeling like I can't be at my best. I can't get the things done that I want to get done. And I feel torn between these two worlds, because I know the arguments for fasting. It does make a lot of sense. And we said in last episode, fasting can even be good for democracy, right? For the kind of spiritual and emotional benefits it provides. But I'm also a product of a liberal secular society, and that's pulling me in this other direction, which is making me reflect more on the kinds of dilemmas that American Muslims find themselves in living in America. I mean, we're one of the first generations that have been, fully integrated in American society, born and raised here. This is a relatively new experiment. And during Ramadan, I see a lot of other Muslims for iftar and other kind of social gatherings after sunset. And I've also been struck by how much this discussions of the inner tension come out from other people I'm talking to, where they feel torn as well. Not just about Ramadan, but also more broadly, people who they want to be part of American society and American social life, and that has its own pull, but they want to be better Muslims. And on things like, the usual suspects, like dating, relationships, drinking, recreational drugs, and so on, there are these things that everyone else is doing on a somewhat regular basis, and there is a pressure to take part in those things in a kind of social setting throughout the year. But then, you also want to get more religious, and that requires separating yourself to some extent from that. I mean, there's a lot there, and what I really want to get to as we kind of like unspool this is my bigger fear that liberal societies are not designed for religiosity, and we're fighting a losing battle. And there is not a single, quote unquote, liberal democratic society. There may be one, and I'm just missing one, but that where religious identification and religious belief hasn't declined significantly over the past several decades. So this idea that we can maintain strong commitments to religious faith, practice, and community in the context of this very powerful liberal secular current, I think it's really worth asking whether this is possible. And this isn't new in the sense that I've often argued that, Islam is resistant to secularization. It's exceptional in this sense, and that's actually a good thing because it gives people the structures to stay religious. They still have those constraints more broadly around them in society. But obviously in a Muslim minority context like America, we don't have any of those structures. It's really just up to us.
I mean, there's many reasons why these conversations are fun, Shadi. I think as a Christian, obviously Christianity has developed here in the United States for a lot longer than Islam at a mass scale. So Christianity and America have been negotiating their relationship for, 400 years. And one of the reasons why I enjoy these conversations is that they reveal important ways in which Christianity and America don't fit one another quite as smoothly as some Christians imagine. So, for example, the Christian conviction of the Sabbath, that we should not work on Sunday, that we should rest. And yet many American Christians work on Sunday, and they have given in to a working culture in very important ways. And they don't recognize this, and they might not recognize this until they listen to perhaps a Muslim neighbor who's struggling to hold to a fast in an American culture that doesn't embrace that. So, American culture does not like Sabbath rest, right? American culture likes working 24/7 and total productivity, and resting feels like a waste. We can think in terms of consumption, poverty. There's a wide variety of historic Christian ethics that, Christian culture in America has capitulated to the nation around it. And it's not until we interact with another faith like Islam, who is also struggling with this identity, that we come to see how much we as American Christians have capitulated to, broader American cultural trends. So I'm appreciative of that. I think, but you brought up a lot in there. I think one of the questions that kind of hangs behind it is the argument being made by Catholic integralists, which is that we need a religious state that can create laws that make it easier to be people of faith, that we need laws that can sort of prop up religious ways of being in the world. I wonder, you mentioned that as sort of a haunting concern for you. Could you talk a little bit more about that and Catholic integralism and your own personal wrestle with, do I want to live in a free and liberal society, or do I want to live in some form of a religious state that sort of props these things up?
Yeah. The great thing about liberalism, but also what makes liberalism dangerous to religion, is that it is actually pretty compelling. Like, I would never want to live anywhere else. I absolutely love America and living in America. But I say that precisely as I also realize that it's not necessarily been great for the kind of more religious Muslim I would like to, in theory, be, So, and that is really the power of liberalism, is that it puts us in this kind of liminal state of both happiness and unhappiness. And we see it all the time. I mean, obviously, I think most Americans would acknowledge that it's wonderful that we have the blessing and privilege to have been born and raised here or live here currently. But at the same time, there is an epidemic of despair, depression, loneliness, which we touched on in previous episodes. And it's becoming a mental health crisis. So those two things can coexist, the wonders of America, but also the fact that a lot of us are unfulfilled and unhappy. I have said, one thing I'd like to say in the past to unsuspecting audiences is that America is the best place in the world to be a Muslim today. And I would have said that, I don't know, like 4 or 5 years ago without a second thought. I don't know. I would probably still say it, but with a caveat. Also, it's a low bar because a lot, the rest of the world kind of like sucks in this regard. And certainly Muslim majority countries are pretty bad when it comes to being a Muslim, somewhat ironically, or maybe not. So, it's a low bar, and America definitely clears it, but still, like, you know, it probably would have been easier to be a Muslim in the time of the prophet. Granted, there was persecution and people had to fight in battles, but in terms of like the strength of one's own faith, when you had Prophet Muhammad and the companions around you, you weren't going to really doubt as much about your religious faith. You would have felt much more closely connected to God. You wouldn't have had to worry about the cult of productivity. You would have been in a nurturing community, but also later on, after Prophet Muhammad established the first kind of Muslim proto-state in Medina, that the whole structure of the broader society is oriented around helping Muslims be more in touch with God and more committed, and that's not just a question of belief, but also fulfilling the various rituals, charity, almsgiving, helping the poor, breaks for prayer. So, no one would expect you to be productive or doing work or being a merchant during the prayer time. So you have nothing else to do when everyone else is going to the mosque. So even if you don't really feel like it, you're going to get your prayer in,
So, Shadi, I want to push you here because I feel like you're setting up a little bit of a false choice. That's a very common false choice that I think the Catholic integralists and liberals both jump into, which is we have to choose between a totally free individualistic society or a religious state that structures and creates a society in which religion is easier. That there are only two choices, and that's what they are. And I think that basically in this political imagination, all we see are individuals trying to live out their religious convictions and a state that creates an apparatus of laws in society. And I think what you're missing in your account, and what so many Americans miss, is the mediating institutions, the mediating communities that are in between the individual and the state. And that is historically what has made America a country that had deep religious freedom, deep individual freedom and a flourishing religious marketplace at the same time. And what's actually missing in America today is that, honestly, the failure of those mediating institutions, the failure to build strong churches and strong mosques and strong, Christian and Muslim associations and schools, because I think what the true issue is that religion and spirituality in America has become too individualistic rather than communal. And so I think the core challenge, Shadi, is not that you need an Islamic state that will help you be a better Muslim. And it's not that you just need to be a better individual Muslim, like you just need to suck it up and have more willpower and be more religious. I think what you actually need is a Muslim community that would surround and carry you from time to time when you fall down. And so, like, Ramadan is meant to be communal. And that's the case for Christianity. So I'll stop talking about Muslims. I'll talk about Christians. Like, Christians in America really struggle with this individualism. It tears apart churches and it hollows them out because they believe that the purpose of a church is to serve their individual needs and wants. They go to the church wanting to be fed, wanting to be encouraged, wanting to be helped, rather than understanding that the church is a place to serve others and to be pushed and grown, and to be challenged and to be made uncomfortable and to have to sit next to people that you don't necessarily like. So we show up at these religious institutions as consumers, as individual consumers, and we shop for different churches that might serve us well. And so when those church institutions fall apart, then you fall into this form of American Christianity that can only see the individual evangelical and the state. And now I'm going to make a big jump here, and it is to Trump evangelicals and this formation of an evangelical identity that is not rooted in a small local church, but it is rooted online in these mass culture war movements that are deeply connected to political leaders and political institutions. So evangelicals are not primarily being formed today in small group ministries and with one-on-one contact with their pastor. It's in, mega churches, online, mega protests and social media. It's not in small, slow, embodied religious communities and institutions. And so as those mediating institutions weaken and fall apart, then all you have is a bunch of random individuals trying really hard to be religious on their own, by themselves. And then they try and they fail and they get down on themselves because religion is this solitary practice. It's something that you do with your solitude. And you can't maintain that. And so I guess I would just say that, this revival of Christian nationalism or Catholic integralism, or even Islamic extremism, part of it is this sense that, okay, I can't do this faith thing alone. I can't do it by myself. So I need a political leader to do it for me. Like I need a political system. I need the state to help me because I can't possibly imagine a community that would help me. And so that's the false choice that I want to push you on, that it's not either state enforcing religion or just being a better spiritual person, that there's these mediating institutions that we need. So.
Yeah, this is great. Before I get to all that, I want to just share a little anecdote because it gets to part of what you're saying here. Maybe I've told you this before. I don't think I've said it like publicly, but okay, there was this time, it was in Cairo in the mid-2000s. I was relatively young back then. And I had never seen someone doing drugs before. So I was in a taxi with a friend of a friend, and it was a kind of like random collection of a couple people. So I was with this guy in the back seat who I just met that day. And he pulls out like a hashish joint. So hashish is just like the Egyptian version of pot. And he's just smoking in the back of the cab. And I had not like really seen this before, and I wasn't used to the idea of Muslims doing recreational drugs. Anyway, we're talking, and he, I mentioned like what I do. At that point, I was probably a graduate student working on Islamist movements in Egypt and the broader region. So we got into this conversation about where is he politically and ideologically? Does he sympathize or dislike Islamist groups like the Muslim Brotherhood, that sort of thing? And somewhat to my surprise, he kind of went into an impassioned like mini speech about how he wishes Egypt could be an Islamic state. But then I was like, well, wait a second, I wouldn't have guessed that because you're smoking a joint in front of me. And he said, well, yes, that's precisely the point. I want the state to prevent me from smoking this joint. And he felt shame for not being a better Muslim, and he had kind of, I suppose, given up, at least in this particular example. And he was reaching for a higher power, but not God, the state, to do what he was not able to do himself. And I think that is just like a kind of extreme example of the point that you're making, this sense that we can't do it on our own and someone else has to step in. Now, on the false choice, so I actually think that there is sort of a middle ground, but I wonder if the middle ground is possible, which would just be something more or less like America is today, but in America that is more conducive to open and outward religious practice and identification, where religion wasn't stigmatized, especially in major urban centers, especially among young people on college campuses, etc. That, if there was a way to have a liberal society which still had a deep and abiding respect for religious faith and did not work at cross purposes with it. And America, one might argue, was like that as recently as a couple decades ago. But the question is that middle ground possible on the macro level when there seems to be something about liberalism that always wants more for itself? And then there's this kind of natural secularizing process which never seems to end. Religion always finds itself in a weaker position because of the overarching power of the liberal idea, and also the fact that
but Shadi,
yeah, sorry. Okay, push me.
You said there's a natural secularizing process, and we had an episode a while back about the problematic use of the word religion. And I think it might be talking about secularism as if it's the absence of religion. I would simply say that it is a new and emerging religion that is at the moment beating Christianity and Islam in America. Secularism, individualistic, liberal secularism, is winning in America, and it's beating Islam and Christianity in terms of recruiting the youth. But what I would say, and I'd imagine you'd say something similar, is that it is an open question how sustainable secularism is. As you just recently wrote about the high rates of anxiety and depression in the youth today, and their struggles to find identity. It is an open question as to whether secularism can produce, emotionally healthy, stable, virtuous societies in which people are generous and open and humble. But I think it's better to speak about America converting to secularism than losing religion. It's not losing religion. It's just religiosity is moving in an important sense. And one sociologist I liked, he talked about how religion is becoming disembedded from institutions, and it's sort of having a free radical spirituality in which we're looking for spiritual identity and purpose in politics, in meditation, in mindfulness, in dieting and exercise, fashion, whatever it is. It's not that we're less religious in America. It's just that our religious practices have shifted to consumption and shopping and those sorts of things. But it's an open question as to whether or not that's good for us, right? And I'm not sure.
Oh, no, but is it even an open question? It seems like we have the answer, and it's not. Wait, I mean,
yeah,
we're saying that it's not good.
It's not good for us. Yeah, I'm trying to be generous.
Yeah. But okay.
So it's that the state, liberalism, it's influencing the state, the academy, medicine, corporations. Yeah, it's widespread, and that does make it more difficult for Christianity and Islam to flourish in America. And historically, Christian states have done the same thing to Muslims and liberals and Jews, and Muslim states have done the same thing to liberals and Christians.
Wait, what do you mean the same thing?
So we have historical records of Islamic states making life difficult for Christians, Jews, atheists. We have historical records of Christian states making life difficult for Muslims and liberals and so forth. This is how religion typically behaves. And a secular state is no different. Secular states often make life difficult for other faiths. And that is sort of the way of the world. And every faith has to wrestle with this question of how do you deal with minority communities?
Yeah. So, a question to you on this idea of being disembedded. Because, yes, if you find a community, you can embed yourself in that, and that can help. So I wouldn't say I'm unmosqued. I mean, there is a Muslim community center and a mosque that I go to currently. That said, in terms of being more strongly embedded in Islamic practice, I have been thinking more recently about whether exploring certain Sufi orders might be an interesting path. Because one problem that I've had historically is seeing Islam or seeing religious practice as being primarily about the fear of punishment or hellfire specifically. And, I think we talked about this in season 1, that there has been this modern shift away from Sufi spiritual practice, which emphasizes more love of God instead of just fear of punishment. And, those are maybe two ways of looking at why people try to commit good deeds and to do what God commands of them. And you operate at those two levels. At the most basic level, fear can be enough, but is fear sustainable? And is fear the best way to get closer to God? And that's where the second step of loving God or reaching towards God becomes more important. And I think, unfortunately, in the modern period, the Sufi aspects have been de-emphasized because they've been seen as otherworldly, mystical, irrational, not in tune with modern life, not in tune with productivity and practicality. It just seems backwards and retrograde. And so Muslim reformers over the course of the 20th century very consciously began to stigmatize Sufi approaches. Anyway, but the Sufi approaches are helpful in that they can kind of unlock a spiritual depth. Now, the problem is, as an individual, if I'm looking at these various options, I'm sort of back in a place as a consumer. I can look at, okay, here's option 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. Here are this Sufi community has a certain vibe.
You're back to shopping, Shadi.
Shopping,
right?
exactly.
You're shopping for a different, Islamic theology or practice that might help you. And I think Sufism might do that. But I think, like you recognize, it seems to me that you actually need an institution. You need a community of people who know you.
But I have to choose that, though.
You do, and that is the difficult part, right? It's not forced on you, so you do have to choose. But you need. It's not so much that you go to a mosque, but that the mosque is yours and you belong to the mosque in a way. That the mosque belongs to you and you belong to the mosque, and they know who you are.
Yeah.
And you know who they are. And so because you need a space, a communal space in a liberal society that can help you believe. Literally, like, we cannot believe alone. And it reminds me of this time I was in this church in Seattle, which, is a notoriously secular city. I think less than 5% of people in Seattle go to church. And I can remember a pastor saying to us that, hey, we're going to stand up and say the Apostles' Creed. And if you can't say it today, don't worry, we will say it for you. And it is, I think it's the sociologist Peter Berger who talks about plausibility structure, that we need a community that can make faith plausible to us. So when you're all alone in your house, Shadi, I know you're a single guy, right? Well, you need a community within which Islam makes sense, and Islam is attractive, and Islam is life-giving. So being able to see other people who can model that for you and help you, you need that plausibility structure as a human being in order to believe, because secularism is, Charles Taylor talks about this, secularism is this awareness that your life could be otherwise. Right? It's this awareness that you are contingent, and maybe you could have been born a Buddhist or an atheist or a Jew. And so you're sort of walking about a secular city, and you're haunted by this sense that your life could have been otherwise. And it seems kind of random that you're a Muslim or that you're a Christian. And so what Berger says is we need communities within which, these things are attractive. They make sense. They help us understand. The other thing that Charles Taylor would say, though, is that in a secular society, everyone is haunted by this sense that their life could be otherwise. So it's not secular society is hard for Christians and Jews, but it's also hard for secular people.
Yeah.
Because they're haunted also by this realization that they might be wrong too. There might be a God. And what if there is? And so that's what it is, right?
And I think at some level, all of us, well, maybe not all of us, but I think it is quite common even among believers in the American context. Are any of us 100% certain that we're right? And I don't want to go into like potentially tricky territory here where people will get the wrong idea of what I'm saying. But I do think that when you actually talk to people, the vast majority of even like believers, practicing observant Muslims, they're not 100. There's no way to be 100% sure that we are correct about Islam. Now, I'm as sure as I think that I can possibly be in the current context, but what is that, 99%, 98%? Because ultimately, like, let's say you have Muslims and Christians, they both believe that they're right about their account of the truth and the nature of God and so forth. But we do know, just as a matter of like logical, like just in terms of like how reality works and how you can have two contradicting ideas be right simultaneously, we will find out after our lives who was more right than the other on particular truth accounts. So all of us are going around saying that we're like 99% sure that our religion is right. But of course, like, I think deep down we understand that some of us are going to be wrong.
Well, I think doubt is an important part of being human. It's also an important part of being a person of faith. And both Islam and Christianity have real resources for wrestling with that doubt and being honest with that. Islam and Christianity do not ignore the human experience of doubt and the human experience of faltering. And I think that would be my definition of fundamentalism is the total rejection of doubt.
Yeah.
This sense that I think we quoted Zizek, maybe it was in our first episode, but Zizek talks about the fundamentalist is the person who knows absolutely. And and he asked this question of who are the fundamentalists, and he, very thankfully doesn't create a division between the quote unquote religious and secular, but that any human being is capable of fundamentalism. So there's such a thing as secular fundamentalism.
Oh yeah, for sure, for sure. Okay, so one thing I want to share, because it gets to I love this Peter Berger quote to the effect of secularism,
plausibility structure,
but like secularism is the possibility of living other lives.
Yeah.
And always having that possibility in front of you, and you have all these kind of counterfactual existences. It made me think of really a fascinating tweet from the other night from my friend. He's a philosopher and writer, Oliver Traldi, and we can include a link to this thread in the show notes. I think it captures this really well, and I actually really give him credit for being this open and vulnerable on Twitter. So he says this, quote unquote, "A feeling I get in certain kinds of situations is that I'm not quite up to the task of living my own life, given that it's a whole life and that there's only one. I get overwhelmed by emotions and paralyzed by choices, and I often falter in moments that turn out to be important." Next tweet, and then I'll just stop there. He says, "I can't get used to the fragility of everything and the necessity of continuing to make decisions in each and every moment. And I don't feel I have immediate access to my own desires. Just figuring out what I myself want can take so much time that I can't get it anymore." And I love this, because I think this just sort of like captures like the current moment of confusion in American life right now, in light of all the personal challenges and the sense of being torn in different directions, that we are really overwhelmed by this unlimited amount of choices. And the fact that every day, I mean, if you just think about this more consciously, and I wouldn't actually recommend that you do this all the time, and you think about how over the course of the day, you're doing a lot of deciding, and those small choices can have unanticipated impact because they build. And then you have all these counterfactual lives that you could have lived, and each day you're deciding which possibilities to close off and which possibilities to embrace. And I think for a lot of people, that can be really overwhelming. And we talked about shopping for religions. I think sometimes people will they try out these different options. None of them really fits. And then it's sort of like, where do we go from here? And then they're paralyzed. But anyway, that just really resonated with me.
Yeah. That's a rich quote. It reminds me of this other, I think it was a poet who said, "I don't believe in God, but I miss him."
Oh,
and this longing for someone somewhere to give me an identity, someone somewhere to make a choice on my behalf. And there's this important aspect of modern individualism, that we create our own identity, that we give ourselves purpose, that we are the captains of our fate, that we make our own meaning. And there is this belief that if we break away from faith, if we break away from institutions, we will be completely free. And yet we find this lament in secular society that personal choice does not create freedom. It doesn't create flourishing.
Well, Matt, let me ask you something. So there's a quote that I like a lot that from, I call him an evangelical friend, but it's really your quote. Yeah, so basically, according to Matthew Kaemingk, he says, "You only learn about the river when you try to swim against the flow." Oof, I like that a lot. This is one smart dude, smart theologian right there. And then I think you also said, as a kind of addendum to that, quote unquote, "It's a dead fish that goes with the flow." And we have talked about the strangeness of being a believer in a secular society, and how in some ways we have to embrace the idea of going against the current. But since it's your quote, I'm curious, like, how difficult should religion be? So for believing Christians who want to feel and be more Christian and closer to Christ, to what extent should they feel like they really have to consciously go against this overwhelming current? Is that the way? Is that something that we should accept? Is there some pleasure to be had in that process, because strangeness is actually good for the believer, to feel strange and to feel that you're standing out and you're doing something that other people are doing? Or should there be a way to actually go with the flow at least a little bit more?
Yeah, there's a lot there. I think, well, first of all, I have to say that the fish and river analogy, I think I pulled that from C.S. Lewis. So I don't think that's an original. I don't think that's an original Kaemingk there, but it is really helpful, and I think it helps understand what's happening a little bit for you with Ramadan. Is that in fasting, you're pushing against the stream of productivity, right? Because when you fast, you're not as productive. And you discover through fasting something important about Washington, D.C. and American society that you would not have recognized it unless you fasted. You would not have recognized how obsessed this society is with productivity and consumption. The only way you could see that about America is if you went against the American stream of productivity. So it reveals that. Similarly, for a Muslim woman who wears the hijab, she learns something important about femininity in America and sexuality in the West and gender relationships by putting the headscarf on. Her very public presence actually helps her neighbors reflect on what they think about gender and what they think about clothing and so forth. So it is by flowing against that. Now I've lost the second part of your question. What was the second thing you were talking about?
Well, I mean, there are other options of thinking about the current, and I guess this gets to the basic question: how difficult should religion be?
Oh, yeah. Well, I guess I would just say that I don't. First of all, I think it is good for religion to have to fight for itself. I think that faith is healthier when it is not upheld by big political structures. I think when faith and politics are married to one another and they serve one another, it's bad for politics and it's bad for faith. And it tends to make faiths lazy, cruel, and stupid. So I think it's bad for Christians and it's bad for Muslims to reside in those kinds of states.
Okay, just a little point of clarification. In our famous Is the Caliphate Good episode, which I would highly recommend to our listeners, that was episode number 10, and we can include a link to that in the show notes. Matt, if I recall, I got the sense that you were more sympathetic to our guest's case for the caliphate than I was. So but now you're saying, like, in a stronger sense, that this state structures kind of subsidizing religion makes religion lazy and, it's bad. So, I mean, but I don't think it's that simple. I think, do you want to maybe just explain?
Yeah, absolutely. What I was sympathetic with in terms of the caliphate is his argument that Islam is a political religion that demands certain political structures and wants certain political structures, that Islam is not a personal spirituality. It's not just an individualistic belief and practice, but Islam has, political structural changes that it wants to make. And in that particular conversation, I felt like you were individualizing Islam to a personal spirituality that could fit nicely within liberalism. And I felt like he was pushing back at you at that and saying, no, actually, we want a political structure. And so I was just sitting within the logic of Islam.
Yeah, which is actually like a really cool thing I mean, I'm glad that you put it that way, because I don't think we do this nearly enough, of sitting in the logic of another's faith. And that you were able to do that over the course of an hour and a half episode is actually like really impressive. And I'd recommend it to others to give it a shot.
So, but it is to say that, like, I'm not as versed in Islamic history as you are, but I can say that for Christian history, the Christian church has not been terribly healthy when it marries itself very closely with the state. So, I mean, particularly if we're talking about today, the Russian church and the Russian state serve one another in some pretty unhealthy ways. And it's not good for either side. So I think that, and then here, this is, I'm following Abraham Kuyper's political theology here, that he wanted, generous freedom for religions to exist in public life, but he didn't want them propped up by the state. He wanted them to have to fight for their believers. He wanted churches to exist because they were healthy, good churches, not because they were getting paid by the state or getting special treatment. He wanted, corrupt and sloppy and lazy churches to close. He thought that was healthiest for faith, and he thought that was healthiest for democracy. And so similarly in America, I don't want the American government to give Christianity special political favors, because I think that's bad for Christianity. I think it's unhealthy for us. I think we should expect things to be difficult. So that, I'm sorry, getting to your question about difficulty. I think if your faith can't exist in a difficult environment, then it's not worth believing in. I think that's what I would say. It's not worth fighting for, and it's not supposed to be easy. At least within Christianity, we're promised a cross. That's not a happy back massage.
Yeah. Well, okay, so religions have to fight for themselves, and that's good. Point taken. But what happens if religion fights for itself and keeps on losing? Because that seems to be the case. At least, if there's a story that we can tell about the modern era, particularly in America and Western Europe, and to different degrees elsewhere, it is a story of a kind of almost like unstoppable decline, and one that's quite precipitous. So clearly, Christians at least have not managed to rise up to that challenge, and they may have fought a good fight. I mean, I suppose the jury's out on like how good of a fight it was, but
well, I think there's a number of different ways to go at that. I think in one way, you could say that yes, Christianity is losing in terms of fewer people are going to churches, but in another way, Christianity won in very important ways. So one thing that Christianity cared a lot about was care for the poor. And now the care for the poor is a central tenet of every Western society and state. Christianity established hospitals, and now there are vast and very generous healthcare systems throughout the West. Christianity established universities and cared deeply about schools and the education of children. And now there are schools throughout the West that are generously funded and anyone can be a part of. Christianity cared about the rights of women, and in a Roman society that did not. And now women are empowered throughout Western society. So in very important ways, Christianity won a a variety of moral and political arguments in the West. And the West is living off of moral and political capital that Christianity created. On the other side, I would say that I think it is a good thing for Christianity, for certain forms of Christianity to lose for a while. That Christianity in the West needs to be humbled. It needs to be disciplined, frankly, because it has participated in some tremendous evils: slavery, racism, foreign wars against Islam, an obsession with consumption, and a total disconnection from the person of Jesus and his teachings and his love. And so there's an important losing that I think would be really good for the Christian.
Losing can be good.
Yeah.
It's not all about winning.
I mean, brother, it is Holy Week right now, and we're coming up on Good Friday, and the center of the Christian faith is the cross, which is, a symbol of failure and loss, and a belief that strength and life comes out of losing and sacrifice. And so I think that's core to how I think about the state of the American church today. Is I am hopeful that in and through death, the Holy Spirit will create a better church in and through this, and will teach us something important. And frankly, the church is growing in really amazing and dramatic ways in Africa and Latin America and Asia, and they will be leading the church, and are leading the church today. So those are some of my responses to what you have to say. I'm curious, to answer your own question, should faith be hard? Could you speak to that? I think you said something like Islam is supposed to be easy. You were saying before the podcast. What did you say to me about Islam being easy?
Okay, well, the Quranic verse says something. It is to that effect. God desires ease for you. He does not desire hardship for you. And then the prophetic hadith is, make things easy, not difficult. Cause people to rejoice, not to flee. And obviously those have to be understood in their own context, and not kind of oversimplified or misunderstood. But there is a sense that if you have two equally legitimate options in Islamic law, that there's a kind of wisdom in choosing the easier course. So if God is allowing you to, for example, shorten and combine your prayers when you're traveling, as many Muslims do, that is perfectly okay, because God doesn't want to make it difficult for you when you're traveling. So, but others might say, well, we want to go above and beyond and still do the full prayers in their separate times and so forth. But that kind of that extra intensity moves Muslims away from this idea of being the middle people. So there's Islam is the ummah is supposed to be the community of Islam is supposed to be a community of the middle, the wasat in Arabic, and that's something that Muslims will often say. There is something to be said for the middle path. So that I think is all. I think that makes a lot of sense in a Muslim majority context, but the question of ease and difficulty, the standards by which we make those judgments of ease and difficulty are very different in liberal societies, where we have a completely different idea of what it means for things to be easy. It means choosing whatever you want. It means having all of these choices. It means not living under constraint. It means not engaging in serious practices of self-denial, so on and so forth. So I just think that even if Islam was meant to not be super difficult in the beginning, it has become more difficult. And, we touched on this in the Andrew Tate episode, which I would also highly recommend. that this idea of Islam being tough and badass and, difficult, and it goes against the liberal consensus and all of that. That is one reason that some people are attracted to Islam, precisely because it's not soft and fluffy like supposedly Christianity is, at least from this perspective. And I know, of course, we're not endorsing that view, but it is a view that people have. So I think there's two ways of looking at it. And, the Catholic integralists and other or small o Orthodox Christians do emphasize the degree of difficulty in Christianity. I mean, Rod Dreher at the American Conservative often makes this point that orthodoxy is more compelling precisely because it's more difficult, that at some basic level people are seeking difficulty. And maybe that's just a reflection of the fact that I'm just not as into this degree of difficulty as I should be, and that could just be a personal failing.
Yeah, there's actually an emerging field called the economics of religion. I don't know if you've ever studied that, but it looks at
that stricter religions actually are the ones that win out over time.
Yeah, that you want to raise the bar, and churches that lower the bar in terms of faith and practice end up dying. There was actually a study of churches in the Pacific Northwest. This more liberal sociologist, he wanted to study churches in the Pacific Northwest, and his assumption was that really progressive churches in Seattle would do well and they would grow because Seattle is such a progressive culture. And so you want to plant churches in Seattle that are progressive, that tell people what they want to hear, and that connect with the culture itself. And so he goes to Seattle to do this study, and he can't find a single progressive church in Seattle that's growing. And in fact, he finds many pretty darn conservative churches in Seattle that are growing. And he's a little bit frustrated by this, but that's essentially the point, is that if your sermon on Sunday sounds exactly like NPR, why not just stay in bed and watch NPR or listen to NPR, right? Like, why should I go to your sermon? Faith actually has to be strange. It actually has to be different in order to exist and flourish in a secular society. And so this sort of chasing of secularism is a bit of a dead end, as these economists of religion would argue, is that faith actually needs to be strange. And, I think in terms of faith's difficulty, I have to look back to, the early church's experience of real persecution. We have American Christians today talk about being persecuted, which is just nonsense to me. They've clearly never, studied what happened to the early church under the Roman persecution, or they're clearly unaware of what's happening to Christians in China and other places as well. And so, I think that we have in America a bit of a persecution complex that we need to be thinking and talking a little bit about.
Well, maybe just a final question on this point before it's lost to history. Okay, so we're talking about the American context, but what if there was a hypothetical, somewhat ideal society where 97% of the population was Christian, but not just nominally, that by and large those Christians were churchgoers, believers? Maybe it would be like a small state and, I don't know, like 50,000 Christians or something. Do you think that would in some ways, obviously then you wouldn't be strange and you wouldn't be going against the current or, trying to highlight strictness in the face of laxity. Do you think that would you want to live in a society like that? I'm not even talking about a Christian state. It would just be probably, maybe even just a neutral state that allows for free religious practice, but it just happens to be the case that the preponderance of the population are committed believers. Do you think that would be better for you and your kids? Or do you think there would actually be a dark side to that?
Yeah, I think that's a wonderful question, theoretical. I think that Christianity is a missional faith, and so it seeks to go out and to engage those who do not believe. And there's one theologian says that the church exists by mission, like a fire exists by burning. So the church has to be moving and talking with non-believers in order to exist. And so it's not healthy for Christians to just be surrounded by other Christians. So I think that absolutely, I wouldn't want, my family or my church to only be surrounded by Christians. I don't think that would be good for them. And it wouldn't be good for me. That's why I enjoy talking to you, man. And that might be a good way to, reflect that we, in scripture, we talk about iron sharpening iron, that you need hard things to push up against and push on you and to sharpen your faith and give you clarity. So
I love that.
I'm grateful for you, man.
That's an optimistic note, and I feel more inspired after this conversation. I'm going to think about difficulty differently now, at least for the rest of today. So thanks. Thanks.
But I mean, the plausibility structure of a community that can support you, I think it's a very important countercultural thing, not to be an individualistic consumer of spirituality and religion, but to be someone who relies upon a larger community, a larger ummah that can carry you from time to time. That's something we need as human beings. We were not created to be alone.
Amen to that, brother. Okay, so thanks to all of you for listening to Zealots at the Gate. Hope you enjoyed this episode. I really did, and I'm really happy we had a bit more of a personal conversation today. If you like what you heard, check out our other episodes and also check out our host, Comment Magazine, at comment.org. And again, we want to hear from you. So you can find us on Twitter at my handle, Shadi Hamid, and Matthew's is Matthew Kaemingk, his full name too. Note the Dutch spelling, or use the hashtag ZealotsPod on Twitter. You can also feel free to send us an email at zealots@comment.org. And please do consider leaving us a rating if you enjoyed this episode.
Yeah, friends, our thanks as well to our sponsor, Fuller Seminary's Mao Institute of Faith and Public Life. Zealots at the Gate is hosted by Comment Magazine. It's produced by Ali Crummy, audience strategy by Matt Crummy, and editorial direction by Ann Snyder. Until next time, I'm Matthew Kaemingk.
And I'm Shadi Hamid. Thanks for joining us.
See you guys.